Before we get started, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for being here and for taking part in round 2 of the Afri-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum. I think that the goal for this session, at least for me, is really about it being forward-looking. The question I'm going to be asking here today is just how do we build on the momentum and the progress that we made this time last year? And I know that a lot of people have talked about this already, but it is no secret that trade that exists right now between Africa and the Caribbean is negligible. It is so far below where it needs to be. It's so far below its potential. And it's not just about the trade that currently exists being small. It's the fact that the trade that exists is so focused on just a handful of African countries and just a handful of sectors and products. So the big question I'm asking is, yes, of course, we need to expand trade from a monetary perspective, but how do we ensure that the gains are broad-based? How do we ensure that a whole variety of African countries are lifted up and a broad range of products, services, sectors are included in that lift as well? I was actually reading, before I came down today, this idea that if we really play our cards right, in the next 5 years, we could actually increase trade on both sides between Africa and the Caribbean by about 50%. And that is a really bold goal, and it almost sounds not achievable. But when you think about having the right infrastructure, the right regulatory environment, nothing really is off limits. So with that, I want to welcome our esteemed panelists to come to the stage. It's been 1 year since this forum started last year, and just give us the lay of the land, just in terms of what has been achieved, what progress has been made, and what more needs to be done.
So I was saying that we have a good sense based on the bilateral investments that have been agreed with the countries, driven by Afreximbank and by the private sector collaborating with Afreximbank, of what the progress has been at the national level. In addition to the initiatives that have been the deals that have been signed between Afreximbank and the countries that have signed cooperation agreements, what the CDF has done is to take a shareholding in Afreximbank that allows us to be in a position to support those projects and the investments going forward. And concretely, what we have done beyond that is to engage their Equity and Investor Relations Department to develop a new financing facility, a growth, resilience, and sustainability financing facility that's going to allow us to attract concessional financing that can be deployed for investment in adaptation projects, adaptation to climate change, as well as projects that will build economic resilience in the Caribbean. We have set a target of $300 million capital raise for that facility, and we hope to be able to launch this by the middle of next year. What we've also done, when the Caribbean office was opened in Barbados, we signed an MOU with Afreximbank that allows us to solidify that partnership that we have established through the shareholding. But it also allows us to support entrepreneurship development in the region. And as was mentioned earlier, we are working on setting up a SME capacity building support facility that would enable the SMEs in the region to develop the capacity and the capability to do business with Africa. And we're also, in line with this, supporting the rollout of the Mansa digital platform, which is a business intelligence and due diligence platform that allows the businesses that register onto that platform to more easily meet KYC requirements and anti-money laundering requirements to enable them to trade easily with Africa. Okay. So these are enabling initiatives that the CDF has undertaken. And as we hear of the other areas of interest, for example, in transportation, that are emerging from the discussions today, we also stand ready to partner with the private sector in enabling those transformative projects to also take place.
Thank you. I want to talk about Africa's perspective now. And Dr. Asfor, I think you'd be perfect as the CEO of the Africa Business Council, because so much of this, just in terms of pairing buyers and sellers, so much of it is about spotting opportunities, and you really do need a middleman to help businesses in Africa, if they are going to expand to the Caribbean, to really spot the right opportunities. Just talk to us about your role in perhaps business-to-business matchmaking and helping some of your clients find the right opportunities this side of the world.
So thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here today in this very important Afri-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum. So since first edition of the Afri-Caribbean in Barbados, we have really developed the relation between the CARICOM private sector organization and the Africa Business Council, which is really mandatory for our business-to-business matchmaking programs, because we have identified certain sectors that we believe it is very important for our common prosperous future as the theme of this meeting. And this will really talk for, as you rightly said, of how we can matchmake buyers and sellers, or matchmake the business opportunities with reference to agriculture, agribusiness, reference to tourism sector, to renewable energy, technology. I mean, there is a huge opportunities in different sectors that we have been really identifying with the CARICOM private sector organization, and I'm happy my brother is here. And it is now really the issue of the second step is to make a mapping exercise of the existing businesses in the CARICOM and in Africa in different sectors. So under Africa Business Council, actually, we have already 20 clusters that speaks for trade, investment, agriculture, energy, oil and gas, which is very important. Healthcare industry, we have already heard about Her Excellency Mayamorti, who have said about pharmaceuticals. So there is a huge potential with reference to the healthcare industry, the pharmaceuticals. For instance, in Africa, for instance, in Egypt, we have like 160 pharmaceutical industries, 400 factories of medical consumables and supplies. We have already heard about the fisheries and the farming. There is one Egyptian company here that's already starting in Barbados with reference to the aquaculture. There is a huge opportunities in the issue of renewable energy. So these matchmaking programs actually need a consolidated structure, which we're happy that we have already signed an MOU in the first edition with the CARICOM private sector organization to really consolidate the Africa-Caribbean private sector and business council. Through this structure, we are happy to see how we go forward in order really to identify those opportunities. We have heard about the transport sector, which is, of course, was very well alluded by His Excellency the President Ali Arfan. Of course, the maritime transport sector is very important. So in those huge issues, we really need to identify the players in the African continent and the CARICOM, and to also identify the capacity for all of us in order to see how we build our capacity in different sectors using the expertise of both regions. So we have a lot of expertise within the African continent, a lot of expertise here, but we really need to combine this expertise to have a real future for prosperity.
I mean, you just heard what Dr. Asfor said there about the importance of these matchmaking programs. We're going to hear from Afreximbank in just a moment. But just talk to us about what a business like yours actually needs. What does it need from governments to be able to truly thrive on the African continent?
You know, when I look at what's happened in a year, I'm actually quite impressed, because here we are, there are companies who have come over to the Caribbean. We've been over to Nigeria and Ghana. There are real opportunities being explored. And you know, there are a lot of places that are no longer welcoming you. There are a lot of countries that are setting up nationalistic barriers to actually working with one another. So I think there's a fantastic opportunity for a continent, a group of countries that's, I mean, you know, several orders of magnitude larger than our region, reaching out to us to create this opportunity. For us as a group of companies, what we really first need is connection. like Dr. Asfura was explaining, you know, whenever you go to do business somewhere, every country is different. Every town, every city is different. The rules, the ecosystem of other businesses, the tax regimes, the labor laws. So connection is really the most important thing when we start thinking of going into new geographies. Understand, so that we could actually work with people who understand and know what it's like to do business in this market. We might know the actual industry, but any new market has its own nuances, its own local ways of doing things that are really important to appreciate. I think that the biggest failures that certainly, or mistakes that we've seen or have made ourselves in the past is where we don't take that into account and expect that we could bring, look, you know, we just know how to do this. Yeah, and arrogance is a big foe of success. So I think that that's, for us, establishing connections that we could really use to, you know, partner with people to get a better understanding of how things work is really the most important thing. Capital, regulation, etc., that follows.
Rodinel talked about it a little bit, just how the Afreximbank is working just to enhance the opportunities that already exist.
Let me start by talking about the state of play currently, and maybe to situate the conversation on why we're even doing what we're doing, why we think that there are prospects as Afreximbank. First of all, I think it was you know, the executive director of ITC who said trade between Africa and the Caribbean is negligible. In fact, their report last year puts it at trade between Africa, exports from Africa is even less, is not even 0.1%. Trade between the Caribbean and Africa is also less than 1%. It's also concentrated, it is not diversified, it's concentrated in primary minerals as well as chemicals. And when you come to the Caribbean, only two countries dominate the trade currently, and that's Bahamas and Trinidad and Tobago. There's also the issue of market access costs. Because we don't have a free trade area or a free trade agreement amongst ourselves, the tariffs that exporters have to pay or importers have to pay is prohibitive. In some sectors, as high as 28%. We also have the issues of regulations, that lack of compliance regulations in various countries, issues around testing, issues around payment, so many issues that are hindering the trade. But they also represent opportunities. But also, as part of the opportunities, is what Prime Minister Mia Mottley said this morning to say that the crisis, the poly crisis our planet is witnessing means, and the supply chain disruptions means that we have to have new partners. And those partners, the African-Caribbean partnership represents one of such diversification interventions. It is important. The prospects, therefore, we see as Afreximbank is the prospects that, for instance, the African Continental Free Trade Area offers. It is the largest free trade area in terms of participating countries since after the WTO. So it's an opportunity of a market of 1.45, depending on the statistics, billion people, 3.5 trillion US dollars GDP. That's a huge market. But also, it also presents an opportunity for those in the Caribbean. But also, we mustn't also forget that the Caribbean also presents a pathway or a gateway to North and Latin America. North America and Latin America that has over, I think it was President Rama that said 7 trillion in terms of dollars in that market. So the opportunities both sides. There are young people in both sides of the divide that creates an enormous opportunity to monetize talents on both sides of the divide. So there are a couple of opportunities. We also heard that today that some of the fastest growing economies are in these regions, in Africa as well as in the Caribbean. Needless to say that Guyana is the fastest growing economy in the world today. So the opportunities, and that's where we see prospects, and it's those prospects that have led us to design the intervention to believe in this movement of deepening trade between Africa and the Caribbean, and we have seen some bright spots. You saw the agreements we've signed, today, and probably in the next round I'll be able to talk specifically about what we're trying to do in terms of providing financing, but also non-financing interventions to support African-Caribbean trade. Because in our context as well, we have defined intra-African trade, and we called it intra-African with an N. And that is to support trade between, not just between African countries in Africa, but also trade between African countries and the rest of the diaspora, and Africans in diaspora. That is Africans wherever they are. Thank you very much.
I love that because it's true. I mean, there is obviously a historical link that we do need to touch on more when it comes to the bond between the Caribbean and Africa. Chuma, let me bring you in. And Chuma was thrown in last minute, by the way, so we have to be kind to him. So your boss, Herbert Wigwe, talked last year about the fact that Access Bank was going to open up new branches in the Caribbean. Give us some good news. Where are we on those promises, and what have been some of the roadblocks that you guys have encountered?
Thank you for the opportunity. I think we have more than good news. I think we have great news today, specifically Access Bank and the Fund for Export Development in Africa, or for Africa, working with Afrexim today, I think in another hour or so, we'll be announcing what is $220 million in capital mobilization, which is anchored by Access Bank to invest in the Caribbean, or broadly, the CARICOM financial services sector. We expect that this will mobilize, just given the multiplier effect of banking capital, will mobilize more than $2 billion in lending opportunities, be it infrastructure finance, be it production finance, be it export finance across the Caribbean. As Access, we're extremely excited for today to be the beginning of a journey that we know will yield a lot of good fruits, will yield a lot of good growth, will yield a lot of trade and further investments between Africa and the Caribbean. So great news today, and very much looking forward to the journey ahead, spearheaded by Access Bank.
Gervais, I want to bring you in now because you and I were talking about this in the hallway as we were getting ready to come in. This idea of when people think about trade with Africa, they want to focus on Ghana, they want to focus on my country, Nigeria. But it's so important that we make sure that the rest of Africa doesn't get left behind, because obviously there's a huge opportunity that exists now between Africa, that everyone's woken up to, that exists between Africa and the Caribbean. So how do we ensure that, I mean, obviously you have to go where you know, right? You have to focus on what you know, go where you have ties to. I think you mentioned to me that you have a father from Ghana.
My father was actually born in Nigeria.
Nigeria, I'm sorry.
Many years ago, though.
So you have obviously ties to Nigeria. But beyond Nigeria and Ghana and West Africa, how do we ensure that the rest of the continent gains as well?
So again, Zane, you have some good questions. I think that people and businesses, uncertainty is something we try to minimize. So people will pursue paths of less uncertainty because, you're trying to minimize risk as you think about investment. But this is going both ways, right? This is going the continent's investment in the Caribbean's investment or trade into the continent. And so I think that the more that there is a role that's played to even the information playing field, then the more useful and easy it will be for people who are unfamiliar to become familiar. So that you'll see that, okay, there is a lot of relationship between Ghana, Nigeria, and the Caribbean. I think a lot of us came from there, is the honest to goodness truth, right? And so there are some connections historically that we have, and so you will hear that mentioned. But that's, again, just familiarity. It isn't necessarily opportunity, right? And so I think that part of these organizations getting together, part of this type of forum, as we begin to help one another understand what are the opportunities on either side that could be taken advantage of. Give the opportunity for people to actually meet with people, because there's something about face-to-face and developing a relationship that allows you to get greater trust, ask more questions, see what people's eyes look like when you ask them things, that then has you sort of, take the chance. And the other thing that we discussed, and the big thing that is missing, is, of course, air transportation. Anybody who came here to Guyana who didn't use the charter I've spoken to has had a tough time getting here. When I went to Lagos and Accra in June, it was a tough journey, and I had to block off 10 days. It's not like I could go to, Bridgetown or Kingston and I spent 2 days and come back. It takes 2 days to get there, 2 days to come back. So I think that part of the infrastructure that we will need to forge to really make this live in time is some kind of air bridge between the continent and the Caribbean. And then you can hub and spoke from one island to the rest, or from one country to the rest. But without that, it is going to be difficult for us to really continue to follow up on these relationships and develop them even further to promote greater investment and trade.
Rodinald, one of the questions that I'm going to ask you a similar question that I asked Gervais there, which is about, but from the Caribbean perspective. So it's this idea of ensuring that the gains are broad-based. The Caribbean, just like Africa, is not a monolith. There's a whole range of different countries with different levels of economic growth and potential and income inequality, etc., and population sizes, which is, of course, a key part of it. When African companies invest in the Caribbean, how do you ensure that the rising tide lifts all boats and certain Caribbean nations are not left behind?
I think the way we would need to do this is to ensure that at all times we are taking a regional approach. We know that for us to benefit from access to the market, that we need to be able to produce at scale. So one of the things that certainly has to happen is in areas where, especially the smaller island states, have a comparative advantage in production, whether in goods or services, we need to put arrangements in place so that that production can be consolidated across the CARICOM single market and economy, so that they can meet the volumes required to be able to access the markets that could be available in Africa. On the capacity side also, because we know that the smaller countries are not as well endowed in terms of the resources that they need to produce competitively and at scale, we need to ensure that there are measures in place that would see more resources going into production capacity building in the smaller states, particularly in agriculture. Also ensure that we work on arrangements across the region so we could have integration of production. That's already happening in the area of food security, where lands available in Guyana and Suriname are being made available to entrepreneurs who have the appetite and who are prepared to invest across borders within the region. So you match entrepreneurship with land resources and capital to produce output across the region. So I think if we take that regional approach, it may not necessarily be a case where you need to put in place compensatory measures to help the less disadvantaged. That is important. But I think to raise all boats at the same time, we take a regional approach that is fostered on private-public collaboration, cross-country collaboration, production integration, scaling up production, getting the marketing support that's required so that we could invest and trade as a region.
Chuma, I'm calling on you again. So, of course, when you start a bank branch in another country, there's always going to be risk, right? And one of the key risks for banks is always going to be, there are many, but one of the main ones will be compliance protocols. Canadian banks have traditionally had a strong presence in the Caribbean, and they're pulling out. And they've talked about this idea of risk factors like natural disasters. They sort of see the small population size that exists in some of the islands in the Caribbean as problematic, because what does that mean for future growth? How do you mitigate risk, or how do you embrace risk?
The first thing that's important to note is that across the African continent, we've seen very similar trends. I would say over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a lot of European banks in particular leave Africa, be it the likes of Barclays, most recently, this was earlier this year, Access Bank also announced the acquisition of 5 subsidiaries of Standard Chartered. So Standard Chartered made the decision to exit these 5 countries for some of the similar reasons as you're probably seeing with Canadian banks in the CARICOM or the broader Caribbean region. It's a mix of factors. I think, speaking to compliance, that's probably, I would say, one of the more simpler or simplistic reasons. I think for many of these international banks, it's a broad range of things, including, of course, smaller populations, smaller GDP, and a variety of realities, which is that the historical ties in Africa, largely driven by colonialism, have been diminished over a period of time. So I think it's time more than ever for, in the case of Africa and in the case of the Caribbean, the local populations to really take stronger control of their own destiny. Now, as Access Bank, we are leading that charge. I already referred to what we are doing in acquiring some of the banks. Standard Chartered is exiting, but we are taking a lot of steps to, irrespective of even the European exit, to create an African financial institution that has significant scale and capacity to support GDP growth, to instigate creation of new industries, to really support significant economic growth in Africa. Now, given what we see as an opportunity along the lines of economic growth for Africa, there is an imperative when you just look at the traditional ties, the roots, in terms of where we really want people in Africa and in the Caribbean. We see a huge opportunity to really connect Africa to the Caribbean from a trade and investment perspective. It so happens that we're doing this at a time where the European or the Canadian banks are exiting this market. All it does is that it creates more impetus for what we are trying to achieve. So I think for us, it's business as usual in terms of growth. I think the exit of international banks allows us to grow faster, allows us to perhaps take advantage of some of these opportunities on an inorganic basis. As Access Bank, we're used to doing business in small countries as well as large countries. Obviously, as Nigeria, we do business, or as a Nigerian bank, we do business in the largest or most populous black nation in the world overall, and clearly in Africa. But on top of that, we do business in places with population of under 2 million, for example, a Botswana, or close to 2 million, I should say, a Botswana. So we're used to doing business in small and large countries. For us, the opportunity is where can we make a difference? Where can we make an impact, right? And as a financial or for-profit financial institution, that impact is really tied to what can we do to really steer the economy towards a growth path, to create opportunities in terms of jobs through economic activity primarily, but obviously anchoring that around trade and anchoring that around investment flows.
I just want to look at big picture analysis. Talk me through your wish list in terms of, I think you mentioned, and I actually mentioned when I introduced the panel, that the amount of trade that exists between Africa and the Caribbean is negligible. What does success look like? What amount of trade as a percentage rather of total trade between the two regions would be significant, would be progress to you 10 years from now?
I'm not so sure it's about what amount of trade will be significant, or what will success mean for us. I think we're on a journey, and the progress we've made in 1 year is attests to the fact that we're serious about this. So we will continue to do what we've done. We pride ourselves within Afreximbank with having a high implementation quotient. If you think about how long ago we started this journey, in less than 1 year, what the attainments so far. We have 11 Afri-Caribbean countries that are now members of the bank. We've opened a branch, and we continue to deploy interventions. Somebody talked about risks here, risk perception and how to mitigate those risks. What I can tell those ones is that we have an Afreximbank that will deploy its guarantee suite or guarantee products. that will ensure that payments assurances are made on both sides of the divide to our members' countries, that will ensure that your investments, for instance, are protected in a sense that you can continue your normal operations in any African country or in their member Caribbean countries, and that you do not have to worry about repatriation of your profits, in a manner of speaking. We have a suite of guaranteed products. We actually even support government's commitments to project promoters. Besides that, we also have a trade facilitation program, which is to support. In His Excellency's presentation today, or his speech, which is the President of Guyana, he did say that 50% of our books, of our disbursements were to financial institutions, and that's why we signed with yourself so that we can use you as a conduit to lend to businesses in your country and in the Caribbean, and that's why we're partnering with the banks that we're doing here to do that. But beyond that also, it's not just about financing. You can easily qualify as one of our champions, Mercy, and I think we started having that conversation. The businesses, the trade forums or trade missions that we have held, over 5 of them in the past 1 year, have been with businesses that are able to invest here. Madam Asfa mentioned about Evergreen of Egypt, and that also addresses your point, Azay, that it's not just about West Africa. The Egyptians are looking into in construction, under our EPC initiative, in aquaculture and fishery, in tourism. One of the transactions we probably sign, or I don't know whether we're signing, I'm not sure, but we're working on, is in Grenada and is expansion of an Egyptian-owned business in Grenada. But it's not just about financing, because I mentioned earlier in my presentation that we have issues with bottlenecks and we need to deploy facilitation instruments. For instance, we started supporting, we are huge on the creative and cultural industry, and I mentioned about the young people as we try to support them monetize their talents. We supported African young people, designers, as well as those in the Caribbean. We supported those in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to walk the runways of Paris and Portugal in the Paris fashion show, and the Portugal fashion show that is held in Porto. We're also trying to extend those to New York. And we're not just doing that because we want people to walk their own ways. We're trying to expose them to brands abroad, to expose them to off-takers. The trade and business forums we've done, the trade and investment forums, as I said, were supposed to be used to support trade exchanges, trade and investment, so that we can exchange. And it's not just trade missions to Caribbean. We've also supported Caribbean missions to Africa. For instance, the Bahamas had one in Ghana that we also supported. The president of Guyana has given us a challenge which we are going to take, working with everybody here, is the transport links. He talked about maritime, but I'll also add the air links. And we already started doing work on that. There's actually a group from Ghana that are looking to support maritime cruises from into Caribbean, but also from Africa that extends to Africa. There's so many other things we're working that we can deploy, here, even our digital, solutions as well. CEO of PAPS is here. President Orama talked about what we're doing with our Pan-African payment and settlement system, but so many other speakers, which is to ensure that you have a payment and settlement system that deals with that sort of removes the reliance on foreign currency, and US dollars and trade can be done in local currencies. It also does one thing, it also reduces the cost of foreign currency cost of trade, obviously, but also the informality of trade, because it brings trade that is informal into the informal space. We also have a MANSA, which is a KYC repository, to deal with the issues we talked about. The reason international banks are leaving is also because of the cost of compliance. Chima, you didn't mention that we're also supporting those acquisitions. That would have been gracious. So it's because of the cost of compliance. And that's why we decided to invest in MANSA. MANSA is a KYC repository, so that should you want to go into any country and you're looking for information on banks, businesses, joint venture partners, and SMEs, you can go to the repository, subscribe to it, and get information. The problem with those international buyers is that they don't want to be bothered. The cost is too high. But we must bother because we have no other place to go. It's about Africa and now the Caribbean. We also have our trader, which is our trade, because I did mention about market access costs. One of the problems with that is the fact that we don't know what obtains in our countries or our regions. There's limited market information. There's limited information about where to source raw materials or what markets there are, not to talk of the regulations. And that's why Trader does. It helps provide information on the trade information, trade investment and market information, as well as trade regulations. I mean, I would like to end here, but I would like to talk about the trade fair. The trade fair also deals with the issue of information, where we can bring together buyers and sellers, investors, and make them with investment opportunities in one platform. The Intra-African Trade Fair that will hold in Egypt next month, between the 9th and 15th of November, is probably the biggest gathering on the African continent of public and private sector to integrate and not only just showcase what goes around on the continent. And now we've introduced the Diaspora Day, which opens up to the diaspora and the members and the Caribbean countries. But also, it also deals with connecting buyers and sellers, discussing issues that affect trade. But there are also elements, it's a B2B, it's a B2G. We're sponsoring buyers so that they can come and reorientate their buying patterns or buying, where they buy from to Africa, and the Caribbean as well. And that's why we're introducing a Diaspora Day. We have a Creative African Nexus, which speaks to our creative. We cannot do this trade fair without introducing the creative because of the huge, as I mentioned earlier, the abundance of talent on the continent, the abundance of youth on the continent as well. We also have an auto show. The auto show will also help to deal with the issues of industrialization. One of the issues with that is inhibiting trade between Africa and the Caribbean. Within Caribbean and within Africa, intra-African, intra-Caribbean, is that it's supply-side constraints. We do not have enough products or services to put into the trade. And that's why we're also going to have an industrialization day that speaks to the work we are doing in the industrial park space, the work we are doing in harmonizing standards, the work we're doing in trying to see how we can offer more testing and certification capabilities so that our goods coming out of Africa and can be extended to Caribbean are competitive. Thank you.
And I'll end with Dr. Asfour. I just want to talk about blueprints. Are there specific initiatives, partnerships that you think we should all be looking to as an example in terms of what can be done here, what can be achieved as we think about how on earth we go about figuring out how to strengthen trade between these two sectors? There must be some kind of blueprint we can look to for an example.
We are following up on that with reference to the initiatives and the program that we can start actually between Africa and the Caribbean. Because as Africa Business Council, we are established by the Heads of State Decision Summit to be the voice of the private sector of Africa. And CARICOM Private Sector Organization is also the CARICOM Private Sector. So among ourselves, we are now putting a roadmap of how we engage our private sector in different sectors. And we have a lot of sectors, actually, that we have already identified together. And from these sectors, we need to identify who is the players within the African continent, across the whole Africa and in CARICOM in different sectors. Like we have, I said already, we identified several sectors which are of huge importance, like fishing and aquaculture. It's a huge, huge, huge potential within the CARICOM, and we are already importing, for instance, in Africa, and we have expertise, again, in this industry. Tourism, instead of going to anywhere, I'm sure the Caribbean is a very nice, and it's a dream for many of us to come to the Caribbean, but we needed to have really investment within the tourism sector and make awareness among our African population to see how they can come to the Caribbean, because there is huge opportunities within the whole Caribbean, but we needed them to know about it and invest in it, so we make more implications. Again, the issue of agriculture, agribusiness, it's huge. I mean, yesterday I had a round here in this beautiful, I know there is 3 rivers here. There is a huge opportunities for agriculture and agribusiness. We need to see how combined Africa and the Caribbean have a real potential of food security. We don't have to import any food from anywhere, but we have to use our expertise. So again, we have to identify the experts with each sector, so we are able to really go ahead. Also with renewable energy, there is huge opportunity. And as His Excellency President Arfan have already said, that we, Africa and the Caribbean, as developing countries, but also having a great bond together and a great historical culture, which is of huge importance, because as Africa, you can see all the developed countries want to come and cooperate with Africa because there is huge potentials and resources and natural resources in the continent. But the only region that we are happy as Africa to really bond with and cooperate is the Caribbean, because it's an extension, it's our 6th region of African Union, of diaspora. So how can we come together with these potentials of human resources, of natural resources, of political will that we have across the whole continent and here in the Caribbean, to come together and make it happen? We don't need the Western world to come and tell us what we want to do, but together we can make it. And that's why it's of crucial importance that the private sector come together with all the help and support. We really thank very much Afreximbank for bringing us here and seeing the potentials that's present in the Caribbean, to see how we can really promote our private sector on both sides to really create a prosperous future. Because a prosperous future, and actually it's our Africa 2063 development agenda, a prosperous, peaceful, integrated Africa driven by the sense of Africa. And we believe with the CARICOM and with the people of our diaspora and 6th region, it's of huge importance to come together.
I loved what you said when you said we don't need the Western world to come and tell us what to do. They don't have to always rescue us. I'll end on that. Thank you so much, and please give a round of applause to our esteemed panelists.